welcome to the Orange County Crosstalk Show. I'm Alex Bolourchi. The Orange County Crosstalk Show is a special program that's coming to you from Anaheim, California. This program focuses on a special event and cultural activity that are happening right here in Orange County. Tonight, I'm at the World Affairs Council in Orange County. They have a special event, and the keynote speaker is going to be Dr. Nader Hashemi, who's going to be talking about the reflections on the struggle for democracy in the Middle East after the Arab Spring. In a moment, let's watch what Dr. Hashemi has to say. I'm pleased to have Dr. Hashemi here with me, and he's going to give us a brief on his topic. First of all, welcome to the Orange County and my show.
Thanks.
And I want to ask you to give us a little brief about your topic.
Yeah. Well, my topic was called Islam and Democracy After the Arab Spring, and I tried to give a positive interpretation about the future prospects for democracy in the region, looking at the question of democracy through the long prism of history and looking at it from a comparative perspective in terms of the struggles that other democracies, principally in the West, and other religious traditions like Catholicism have had to go through in terms of coming to terms with the modern demands of democracy. So in a nutshell, I said that despite what you may think and what many people in the United States feel, that the prospects for democracy are very dim because of the conflict and the chaos and the persistence of authoritarian regimes. If one has a deeper sense of history and a deeper sense of the comparative study of the struggles that all democracies have to go through, particularly with respect to that very difficult question of trying to understand and regulate and democratically negotiate the role of religion in a democratic society, that the prospects for the Middle East and for Muslim majority societies from a historical perspective look, comparatively speaking, not bad.
Thank you very much. Let's watch together a little segment of Dr. Hashemi's talk.
For example, modern representative democracy first emerged in the West in Protestant majority countries and then spread to the rest of the world. Now, of course, there's no simple answer to these questions, nor is there space or time here for me to properly explore them. There's been numerous theories and explanations that have been offered over the years, and there's little consensus on exactly what the nature and the most salient causes are. The broader interpretive point here that I'm trying to convey is that where one begins to investigate a social question, the assumptions that are brought into the initial inquiry can often predetermine the outcome. Assessing the relationship between Islam and democracy demands a sense of history. Unless one can recall the very long and torturous history of democracy in the West, its ups and downs and turbulent trajectory, understanding this topic in other cultural or regional settings can lead to misinterpretation. Comparison is indispensable in avoiding the trap of cultural essentialism and religious exceptionalism. Islam is not the first religious tradition to struggle with the relationship between religion and politics, nor will it be the last. It should be remembered, for example, that the origins of political philosophy here in the West are rooted in the tension between religion and democracy. The various modernization projects and political systems that emerged in the Middle East post-World War II from this experience were often justified in the names of various forms of secular Arab and Iranian nationalism. And by the late 20th century, most of these political regimes in the Arab world were as politically repressive as they were economically corrupt. Ben Ali's Tunisia, Mubarak's Egypt, Saleh's Yemen, Gaddafi's Libya embodied this state of affairs. In Syria today, for example, the ruling regime justifies its rule in part in the name of secularism. And it has responded to pro-democracy protests during the Arab Spring with such extreme brutality that both Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and the UN Human Rights Council have characterized the Syrian regime's behavior as, quote, a crime against humanity. The second point here is that there is a very deep and nefarious nexus between authoritarian regimes in the Arab world, Western support that bolsters them, and the negative political consequences for the future of democracy in the region. Stated simply, Western support for authoritarian regimes in the Arab world has had a tremendous negative effect for the political future of the region. Decades of political repression, particularly of secular civil society, has forced political opposition in the Middle East in the direction of the mosque, thus leading and supporting inadvertently religious-based movements. The forces of religion have benefited from the authoritarian policies of the post-colonial state, in part because all secular rival organizations have been suffocated or crushed. And the election results in Egypt, Tunisia, over the last year, sustain and confirm this point. Similarly, it's also instructive to briefly examine the case of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The rise of political Islam in Iran in the wake of the 1979 revolution made perfect sociological and political sense. The social conditions in the decades before the revolution were a specific and direct byproduct of the authoritarian policies of the US-backed Pahlavi regime, which created a fertile ground for the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in Iran. These authoritarian policies undermined the forces of democratic secularism in Iran and the forces of liberalism in Iran, and inadvertently strengthened the forces of political Islam in the lead up to the '79 revolution. In short, in the same way that the forces of political Islam emerged from decades of authoritarianism as the only credible opposition in Iran, a similar, though not identical situation today prevails in much of the Arab world. To decry this state of affairs is to ignore the political consequences of supporting repressive authoritarian regimes. Ultimately, one cannot support the social conditions that give rise to Islamic fundamentalism and then expect secular Norwegian or Swedish Democrats to emerge after the revolution. Given this enveloping political context, the strength and popularity of religious movements makes perfect sociological sense. In part, I want to emphasize, in part due to long-standing Western support for Middle Eastern dictators. The sociologist Asif Bayat has offered the following words of advice to anyone who is serious about thinking critically about the relationship between Islam and democracy in the Middle East today. And he has noted quite perceptively that, quote, congruence between Islam and democracy is not a philosophical issue, as is widely assumed, but it is really a political issue. It is a matter of struggle, of human struggle. The pertinent question is not whether Islam and democracy are compatible, least of all because of the contested meanings attached to both Islam and democracy, but rather the real question is how and under what social conditions can Muslims make their religion compatible with the desired notions of democracy? How can they legitimize and popularize an inclusive reading of their religious doctrine in the same way that Democrats in the West have done over the long history and struggle to expand the definition of democracy in this society, where at one time democracy really meant a very narrow, white, male, property, restrictive notion of democracy, but that changed over time. Professor Bayat suggests that the future debate on the topic of Islam and democracy should be less abstract, less ideological, and more rooted in actual case studies and solid empirical analysis about the appropriate social conditions that can promote democracy in societies where religion is a key marker of identity. Yes, religious doctrine and theology are important, but equally important are the domestic, regional, and international, and economic and political contexts that shape the contours of religious interpretation, social debate, and political struggle in Muslim societies. And I think to ignore these factors is to do so at our own analytic peril. Thanks for your attention.
Is it safe to say the Iranian Revolution of 1979 was a path or the first step toward democracy in Iran?
Well, in the immediate sort of short-term context, absolutely not, because there was a revolution that overthrew the king. It was very similar to the Arab, Spring revolutions. People wanted to change. But what they got is another form of authoritarianism, another form of dictatorship. So for the last 30 years, it certainly hasn't been a step on the road to democracy. But I think if one then takes a step back and looks at the question of democracy from a longer-term perspective, I think one can make the argument, and I've made this argument in my writings, that the Iranian Revolution in 1979 actually has contributed and is contributing to the eventual democratic transformation and transition in Iran in many different ways. In one important way, that revolution has clarified for millions of Iranians, particularly for the contemporary generation of Iranians living in Iran, the dangers and the deep problems of the intimate connection and embrace between religion and politics. Religion and politics now, I study Iranian politics very closely. There is an internal, organic, deep-rooted and widespread movement for secularism in Iran that is supported not only by the urban middle class, not only by young people, but importantly, by among significant sectors of the clerical community who are outside of political power. Because the last 33 years in Iran has been an incredibly important and painful and difficult learning experience for Iranians about the dangers of mixing religion and politics. In other words, the democratic movement in Iran right now realizes that a precondition for democracy in Iran is the separation of religion and government. Some people want an expansive separation, some people want a more limited separation, but everyone realizes that the future democratic transition in Iran must support that principle in a future democratic constitution. So from a longer term perspective, I would argue that if one takes the 20th century, I would argue that the revolution in Iran has indirectly contributed to the democratization of Iran. But then again, one has to have, I think, the proper perspective and framework here. Democracy is a journey, it's a long-term process. To think that after decades of authoritarian rule, after decades of dictatorship in Iran, supported ironically and regrettably by the United States, that in 1979 you would have liberal Democrats who looked like Canadians or Europeans to emerge from Iran's political experience, I think was wishful thinking. The rise of political Islam in Iran, as regrettable as it was, from a sociological perspective, did make sense. And so that's why I'm very optimistic about the future prospects for democracy in Iran. If you look at the social conditions in Iran, they actually look very good. There is a huge hunger and desire for political change. The prospects, I think, for democracy in Iran look much better than most people, I think, realize. Because if you're just following, Iran from what you hear on CNN or on Fox News, and all you see is the figure of Ahmadinejad who wants to get a nuclear bomb, well then, you may be quite disillusioned about Iran's future. But internally, if one looks at the social, civil society, intellectual debates that have taken place in Iran, the rise of a very powerful and very vocal feminist movement in Iran that has petrified this regime, the prospects do look good. The one negative aspect that could set the struggle for democracy in Iran back by another couple of generations would be a external military strike or attack on Iran that would send us back to the 1950s. So, the answer to the question, ironically, is yes, but then one has to have a sense of history to appreciate, I think, the point that I'm trying to make.
Thank you very much.
On the separation of church and state, how would it look like in terms of a secular civil society? It would look like, it would look like the United States of America. It would look like Canada. It would look like England, where you do have religious groups that are active in society, that are part of the debate in civil society, but there's a recognition on behalf of these groups that there's certain limits that they cannot pass with respect to imposing their particular will. They can organize, they can support, they can finance a political party, they can engage in public debate, they can open a newspaper, they can organize political rallies, they can try and sway public opinion, but they cannot try and violate the constitutional requirements for democracy that exist within the American Constitution. In other words, they cannot have, religious groups and institutions cannot and should not have veto power over decisions that are made in democratic parliaments. That's the key sort of red line that cannot be crossed. And of course, this is a process, as I sort of hinted at, has to be democratically negotiated by societies over the evolution of their democratic sort of experience. Religious institutions and religious groups should not have the right to impose their values on society without there being democratic checks and balances. I think the writing of a constitution, the existence that we have in this society of a Bill of Rights, a basic set of freedoms that cannot be overturned and that cannot be violated by elected governance, is a key sort of requirement that protects minority rights and that protects the violation of those rights by people who come into political office. And of course, the courts are there to sort of adjudicate and make sure that that those basic rights are fulfilled and respected, and that political parties that get elected cannot violate them. So I think that getting that process and sequence right, very difficult process. It's not something you can just flip a light switch and it'll be there. This is sort of the whole history of democracy, is very much trying to sort of write a proper constitution, have it respected, developing an independent court and judicial system that can adjudicate over that can have, in other words, a separation of powers. That is very much what the struggle for democracy is about. It has been about that struggle here in the United States. We don't recognize it because it's an older struggle, but I think that's what we're beginning to see in terms of the contemporary struggles for democracy in the Middle East.
Thank you so much for your time, and Dr. Williams.
Dr. Hashemi, we have a small token of our appreciation. Thank you again this evening for coming to speak with us. All right. Thank you. Thank you.